And we're waiting for Jan Lynn, Professor Jan Lynn, and Rebecca Gerrard. I don't see here yet. And they will also be joining us for a panel, for the first panel. Welcome, Rebecca Gerrard. Thanks for joining us. If you want to just test your audio and if you want to make sure that you can share your screen with us, please feel free to do so now.
My pleasure and honor to be here. So hopefully you can hear me well.
Yes, I can.
Great.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first panel of this fantastic conference. I'm very happy to participate, and let's go ahead and get started. If I'm fine going with the order that the presenters are listed. Is that okay with everybody? Okay, great. Bear with me a second. I apparently closed the tab that I had open. It's going to be that kind of week, I suppose. All right. Our presenters this morning are Rebecca Gerrard, Citizen Action of New York, and she'll be presenting on New York's housing crisis, the fight for innovative solutions that can prevent concurrent gentrification. Jan Lin of Occidental College, protesting gentrification and the right to the city in Los Angeles. And the third presenter of the panel is Kwame Holmes from Bard College. And I don't have a title for Professor Holmes's paper, unfortunately. And the theme that this panel deals with is Chapter 1 of Smith's The New Urban Frontier, and in particular, the connection between gentrification and class warfare. And it's worth noting as we begin and reflect on these papers that in Smith's introduction, he discusses the Tompkins Square squatters protest in 1988, and several protesters had signs that said gentrification is class warfare. So I think that's an important concept to keep in the back of our heads as we listen to our panelists. We have till 12:30. What I'd like to do is ask the presenters to confine their papers to 20 or 25 minutes so we can leave room for questions and answers afterward. Rebecca, are you ready to present? Oh, I'm sorry, Jan Lin is not here. Okay, well then, Rebecca and Kwame, you can take a half hour if you like. Rebecca, are you all set?
I am all set, yes.
All right, the room, virtual as it is yours.
Great, thank you so much. So I am going to screen share. I do have some slides, so bear with me. View, present, great. Okay. Okay, can everyone see that? Wonderful. And so, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. An honor and such an important topic. I really want to spend my time today talking about solutions that have been proposed, right? And why they're not actually solutions, and the sort of intentional nature of that. And what do real solutions look like? And some campaigns that have been centered around that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of how we've gotten there, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that. I feel like this audience is probably really well versed on that. So the parts of this presentation that focus on that, you know, I want to name that, right? This group knows better than anyone else that we could spend an entire day talking about how we've gotten in the crisis of you know, the segregation, right, of housing, how it's intentional and deliberate and has existed throughout the history of this country since it was colonized, right? And so I'm just picking a couple of deliberative moments, but it is by no means a comprehensive list. And then I also really want to, especially given that we have extra time, not spend the whole time presenting, but really excited to have a dialogue about what the solutions look like, and sort of a conversation, right, around how that can be implemented in different communities. So with that said, let's get started. So again, we could spend a whole day on this, right? So these are just some very brief notes on how right, the racist history of housing has gotten us to where we are, which I think is important to ground us in, right? Why we need the solutions we need, right? So we all know about redlining, you know, and I think it's ironic, but still really needs to be named, you know, that the New Deal in many circles is brought up as something that is aspired to and should be replicated in many circles. And the reality is that the New Deal is one of the most racist policies that was carried out in modern history, right, by this country, in terms of providing white people in poverty with a means of escaping that poverty and having government fund white folks, right, with the opportunity to purchase on the condition that it was specific to white folks and that it excluded Black people with the same opportunities, and in fact excluded white people who wouldn't promise that they would sell their homes, right, to Black purchasers. And so I feel like people who are getting on this call probably know that, but we still see, right, in mainstream conversation, the New Deal as something that is uplifted as something we should replicate. And I feel like it's still not talked about enough how absolutely racist that policy was, and a huge contributor of why we are where we are in terms of who has acquired generational wealth and who has not, right? And why we have these really segregated lines of that wealth that has been acquired in terms of racial lines. And then the housing crisis of 2008, right? Where we saw this great disparity in terms of how predatory banking practices were disproportionately targeted at Black and Brown communities. And so when we had this collapse, right, of these loans that were not sustainable, in 2008, we had a really huge disproportionate impact on Black and Brown communities. And so we had a crisis of foreclosures, right? But it was felt in a huge way on Black homeowners when compared to white homeowners. And so I think the statistics are that when you looked at middle to upper class homeowners, Black homeowners were 85% more likely to lose their homes during that crisis than white homeowners. And so again, when we looked at communities that were able, right, Black communities that were able to sort of start to amass some sort of wealth that was attached to property ownership, that was destroyed, right, and really set the seeds for gentrification of these communities that had started to be built. And I bring up these two examples really intentionally because I think they feed these solutions that our government tends to lean into that are not actually real solutions and are part of, you know, what I think is a really intentional plan, is not accidental in not addressing what is a really systemic issue, which is really related to capitalism, right? Which feeds on the oppression of certain racial groups and certain class groups and literally can't survive without those. And that's intentional, it's not accidental. So like solutions, right? What have we tried and have they worked? Public housing. Was it designed to succeed or fail? You know, when public housing was first introduced, right, it was the first project was in 1935 by the Public Works Administration. And the first project was a whites-only neighborhood that was created that displaced hundreds of Black families. And so from its very origin, it was actually not intended to level the playing field for Black communities, right? It was absolutely designed to create these segregated neighborhoods in which white neighborhoods were very intentionally invested in and Black neighborhoods were very intentionally disinvested in and or destroyed. And so this practice really continued in terms of funding resources, right? And how they were prioritized. And it very intentionally and successfully created huge pockets in Black and Brown communities of poverty, right, and disinvestment, and the opposite in white communities where funding was resourced. And then we saw the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And as soon as the government was told, you know, public funds can't be used to advance segregation, we saw the immediate disinvestment, the immediate withdrawal of funds in this program. And there's no denying that immediate switch that happened. And so immediately Nixon enacted a moratorium on housing spending in '74, underfunding and austerity cuts under President Reagan happened in the '80s. And in fact, we have the Faircloth Amendment now, which says that we cannot expand the stock of public housing that we have now. And we know that public housing is an enormously successful endeavor in other countries, where it's enacted in an equitable manner. The reason it's not been successful in this country is that it's very intentionally not been designed to be successful. It was truly and utterly designed to further the divide between Black communities and white communities. And so, you know, it can be successful. The way it was implemented here has ensured it's not. And so we look at the environmental violence that's associated with it too, right? So who's there and where is it, right? 66% of public housing residents are Black and Brown. And meanwhile, Black and Brown people make up 30% of the general population. An EPA analysis found that more than 9,000 federally subsidized properties sit within a mile of Superfund sites. But those same places give public housing properties a clean bill of health because the limit to their analysis of whether something is, the scope of their inspections is so narrow, right? And so it's very building related, you know, test the wall, test this, and trust. That's not even comprehensive, but it doesn't even look at the fact that it's near a site that has toxic chemicals being released into the air and toxic chemicals being released into the soil, right? And so we don't only have the problem of the fact that they've been these communities that were built intentionally for Black and Brown people to live in are underfunded and the building quality is poor, but they've deliberately been built into areas that are environmentally hazardous. So now we look at the solutions, right? And so the main part of what I want to talk about, especially because gentrification, right, is the topic here. And so how do we ever get to a place where we ensure that there's investment that's owed, right, to these communities that have been created, that are disinvested, that doesn't end up in the displacement of those very communities, right? That doesn't end up in the colonization of those very communities. And we don't have those systems, right? Spoiler alert, we don't have them. They don't exist. What we have is that any time we start to address the problems that have been intentionally created by our government in Black and Brown communities, it always ends up in the displacement, gentrification, colonization of these neighborhoods. And so we need to talk about, right, the quasi solutions that have been proposed and why they don't work, and actually what do real solutions look like. So let's look at the housing crisis of 2008, right? Which is one of the examples I brought up that sort of caused this mass, right, crisis in Black and Brown communities of wealth. $700 billion was allotted to banks who were in distress. $700 billion. And $50 billion was allotted to the HAMP program, which was intended to restructure mortgages for people that were at risk of foreclosure. The problem was that there was no requirement on these banks who were receiving TARP to enact HAMP. So you could take your bailout money through TARP as a bank, and you were not required to restructure mortgages for people at risk of foreclosure using the $50 billion that the federal government allotted through HAMP. And so, shock and surprise, a fraction of the money that was allotted actually got out the door. They were able to be made whole, these banks. Their CEOs got their bonuses, their stockholders, right, were able to have the dividends that they were insured. But the homeowners who were about to be homeless had no guarantees, right, that their survival and their housing was attached to those bailouts. And so what we ended up with, and again, remember 85%, if Black homeowners were 85% more likely, Black homeowners of middle to upper class status were 85% more likely to be at risk of foreclosure. And so what we ended up with was a fraction of that money actually being used for the intent that it was earmarked for. And we had nearly 900,000 homes lost in 2008, which was an 80% increase from the previous year. So, you know, it's the typical problem that we'll see as a theme, that where the government thinks that funding the top and expecting it to trickle down or by some process of osmosis affect those who are most impacted is a solution, when data from not just recent history, but from forever has shown us that doesn't work. And another one of the favorite things, solutions that our government tends to lean into are tax subsidies and tax breaks for developers. And so in New York, that looks like probably the most obvious example is the 421A and the 485A tax subsidies. And so the idea is that if you fund development, the housing crisis will be solved as a result of that. And the expectation is that that includes Black and Brown communities, right? And the reality is just the numbers tell us that's not what happens. And that's true of the federal Opportunity Zone program too, that was enacted, which has been an abject failure, just like 421A and 485A have been, right? again, spoiler alert, feeding the free market has not solved the housing crisis, has not solved gentrification. It doesn't work. In fact, it fuels it. It's like gasoline on a fire. And so, so 421A and 45A are the sister programs for New York City and outside of New York City and New York. And so 421A actually has an affordability requirement attached to it. But it's I was going to say questionable, and I also want to say laughable, right? So it's that 10% of the units have to be affordable, and then the affordable is defined in a way that's really not affordable, right? So $3,411 is the average rent on a 421A apartment. And so when we think about affordable, and we think about creating units which create stability in communities that lack stability in terms of housing, that's not the number we think of, right? That's not a number that's going to get us there. And in Buffalo, and I'll say that 485A doesn't even have an affordability requirement attached to it. So for 485A, all you have to do as a developer to qualify for this tax subsidy, which is a sliding scale of no taxes to basically leading up after 10 or 12 years to paying taxes. But it's when your subsidy ends, it's you pay taxes on the pre-development assessment in perpetuity. The pre-development assessment in perpetuity. So you go from paying no taxes to at the end of the term paying taxes on the pre-development assessment. So it's a bananas, right? It's a bananas crazy good deal for the developers. In Buffalo, all you have to do to get that is convert a commercial property to a mixed use property in upstate, outside of New York City for 45A. So you have to take a commercial unit and convert it into a mixed use residential commercial unit. So you just have to add housing. It could be complete luxury housing, and you still get that subsidy. And so in Buffalo, by the end of the decade, taxpayer dollars to the tune of 70 million will have been spent in exchange for no affordable housing. Where we have in Buffalo, Black and brown communities, right, that are suffering from disinvestment. And if you look at like the fruit belt in Buffalo, where we've had investment from 485A, and it looks like luxury development, none of the residents of the fruit belt who have suffered from previous disinvestment have benefited from it. They've been displaced, right? They've been gentrified out. So these programs have not helped anybody, right? They've gentrified people. White people have come into the fruit belt. The Black people that lived there previously have been displaced because they can't afford to live there anymore. And so this is not a solution that's a solution, right? Except for anybody but the developers who are profiting greatly, right? And white people who are able to come in and take over that space. But this is not helping Black and brown communities who have suffered through disinvestment, 100%. And then we look at New York City, right? We look at just one example of a development, Hudson Yards, which cost the city of New York $6 billion in public subsidies. And it created 4,000 apartments, of which 10,000 are affordable. I have affordable in quotes, right? Because we could have a whole separate argument on whether they're affordable, but let's even put that aside, right? Let's assume that 10% were affordable. The city gave $6 billion in subsidies for 400 affordable apartments. Who thinks this is a good investment, right? For the housing crisis that we're in this state. I mean, I defy anybody to make that argument to me, that that's that that's a good investment and good bang for your buck. So this is what the solutions that our government has leaned into, right? And they're not getting us where we need to be, and it's deliberate, right? It's very deliberate. The reality is that we don't look for solutions that actually address the problem. We know the roots of that are in the fact that policy is defined by profitability, and that the real estate industry is a special interest which controls policy development across the country, and most especially in New York. Most especially in New York. And so we have to get to a place where policy is defined by what works for communities and not who's donating to campaigns, right? And who's making deals with those in power. So let's get to solutions that actually do work. This is one of my favorites, and one of the fights that has been most dear to my heart and most painful. So when we passed historic legislation in 2019, which, you know, the campaign was all 9 bills, and what was passed was the Housing Stability Tenant Protection Act. The one bill of the 9 that we didn't win was good cause eviction. And so what good cause eviction does, I'm going to speak in a policy perspective and then an impact perspective, is it says that there can't be an eviction without cause. So right now in New York, it is perfectly legal to evict someone even if they are fulfilling all the rights of their tenancy. So you could be paying your rent on time, taking care of the property, and a landlord is able to issue a holdover eviction. And I'm just going to look at time because I'm getting close to my 30 minutes. So here I said I wanted to not lecture and leave room for conversation, and I'm just talking. You could be fulfilling the rights of your tenancy, paying your rent, and a landlord can issue a holdover eviction proceeding. And it just means I want to take the property back. And the only people protected from that are people who are in a rent stabilization situation. So there are 5 million New Yorkers who are not in a rent stabilized situation. And so that's about 1.5 million to 2 million in New York City and everybody outside of New York City. And every single one of those tenants is subject to being victim to a holdover eviction. So this legislation says there has to be cause. And unlike rent stabilization, there is no requirement on when a building was built. So rent stabilization applies to buildings built before 1974 with 6 or more units. With good cause, there is no year, right? It applies to any year the building was built. It does exclude owner-occupied units, owner-occupied buildings with 4 or less units, but that's the only exclusion. It also says that any increase beyond a certain amount, and I'm not going to name it because it's vague. So the state law says 3% or 1.5 times CPI. The Albany is slightly different, and I'll get into that. But it says any rent increase beyond a certain amount is the equivalent to an arbitrary eviction and must be justified by proving an attachment to cost increases. And we have to have that because if we only had the prohibition of holdover evictions, a landlord could just say, fine, I'm not issuing a holdover eviction, but I'm tripling your rent next month, right? And so it would be one of those laws that like exists without any teeth. So fine, I'm not issuing a holdover eviction, but if I triple your rent next month, it's the same thing, right? It's the exact same thing. And so I want to explain why it's so important, especially in a gentrification lens. In a lens that's not so much related to gentrification, it's enormously important because we have tenants that suffer with really inhumane building unit conditions that can't complain because they fear retaliatory evictions, right? But from a gentrification perspective, this is revolutionary because the reason that we can't ever have investment in disinvested Black and brown communities is that as soon as we do have investment, right, we have roads improvement, we have food stores that come in, we have improvements in schools, medical access, you name it, right? What immediately happens is that white people congregate to it. Let's just call it, right? My people immediately come to it. And proximity to whiteness means an increase in costs. That's reality, right? So now you have white people all of a sudden walking around the neighborhood. You have developers now who are interested in new developments. And even though nothing has improved in units, rents start going up and up and up just because of proximity to development and whiteness. And so people that have lived in these communities, people of color, never actually get to benefit from the access to this investment because they're priced out of the neighborhood. And so the rent increase protections that are in this bill finally set a groundwork for the fact that we can have investment in Black and brown communities that are historically disinvested in without meaning that you're going to have proximal increases in rent that displace the very people that it's supposed to benefit. And it's so necessary and it's groundbreaking. And so we lost it in 2019. We've been fighting for it since, and we continue to have that be an uphill battle. And since I happily agreed to be on this panel, we've had really exciting news. Albany, week before last, became the first city in New York to pass local good cause legislation. It's enormously exciting. And it's not just exciting for the tenants of Albany, but it means so much for our statewide campaign. We have other municipalities that are eager and lining up to move this legislation forward. And we're already seeing the impact on our chances of moving it as statewide legislation. Our assembly member who represents the Albany district, who was one of the people leading the fight against this legislation, issued a quote saying that this is the groundwork for the work that they think they can do in Albany. And he expects this to be taken up next session, which is a 180-degree turn of a stance, right? This local pressure is what we need to make it pass at the state level. And it's exactly what we were hoping for when we started these local campaigns. And I feel really positive about our chances in a way that I haven't in a few years. And it's just so important. And I'll just very quickly go into other solutions that we need, right? Instead of 421A and 485A, we need things like Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. We have got to stop funding outside developers, and we've got to start funding communities. So instead of handing tax subsidies to these developers, we need to be handing subsidies to tenants to have the first right of purchase and funding those purchases through nonprofit housing developers that are able to facilitate, right, and be the third party so that we start to have community ownership. And this is especially important to prevent gentrification. There is no reason in disinvested communities that we should be bringing outside people in to build ownership. We need to be building ownership of the people that have lived in the communities generationally. And that is really how, right, we're going to finally fight gentrification and create the ability for Black communities to create their own path and their own wealth in a way that just hasn't existed. And I feel like I've left no place for questions, but hopefully we'll have it at the end. I completely went back on my promise to, to create space for dialogue, but.
Okay, well, thanks, Rebecca. We will have the opportunity for conversation and questions after both of you have presented. In the meantime, if you do have questions or comments directed at either speaker, you can feel free to enter them into the chat. I will try and facilitate as best I can after Kwame has presented. Thanks, Rebecca. Appreciate your presentation. And next up, I would like to introduce Kwame Holmes from Bard College. Kwame, I don't have a title for your talk, but if you could just go ahead and give us a short synopsis of your presentation and a little bit about your background, we appreciate it. The floor is yours.
Sure, thanks so much. And just thanks again to the organizers of the conference for the invitation to speak with you all. So I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can still see me, you just don't see that PowerPoint. So yeah, I am a scholar in residence at the Human Rights Program at Bard College, which is a pretty unique and exciting academic appointment. It means that I get to do research and writing, but also I get and I am deeply encouraged to be involved in my local community. And I see something in the chat, so I just want to make sure it's not a message that I should.
No, it was me. I'm just realizing I did not introduce. I just launched it. Go right ahead, Kwame.
Okay. Oops, sorry. So to be involved in my local community, and that happens to be Kingston, New York, which is a town of about nearly 24,000 people. Once a major IBM office was here, which left in the 1990s and produced, I don't know it's not a Rust Belt, or maybe it's like a hacked belt, I don't know, virus belt. Anyway, when IBM left, there was some pretty severe downturn, but anyone who's been following the global real estate boom knows that Kingston, New York is one of the hottest real estate markets in the entire country, which gives us an opportunity to study gentrification and displacement in a really different setting than New York City and the kind of major metropolises that I think Neil Smith was imagining when he developed his sort of theories around revanchism and gentrification as class warfare. And because one of the things that I have observed, and I hope I can demonstrate today in this talk about Chis's Hart Street, which I'll explain what that is in just a moment, but that I hope to demonstrate is that within the small town setting, there's a host of social and cultural incentives to sort of totally obscure, not just sort of class warfare, but even like class position vis-a-vis each other. There's a sense that people take care of their own, which is not necessarily untrue, but that kind of sentimentality can really make it difficult to advocate for people who are being displaced by global market forces and by what is in essence class warfare, but hides itself. So what is Chis's Hart Street? Chis's Hart Street is a nonprofit organization started by a woman named Mary Chisholm. Oh wait, sorry, yeah, I didn't want to go to Mary Chisholm, who has offered housing to people with cognitive and physical disabilities since about 2004. And this boarding room house, which I'll talk about at length today, is in Washington Avenue in Kingston, really on the kind of borderline between a working class area and a more well-off area and the uptown commercial district. And as of in December of 2020, after being in operation for many years, Chis's Hart Street was put up for sale, and it left the residents, again, who are folks who deal with cognitive and physical disabilities, in search of housing. So before I get into more details, I just want to talk about the people who I work with and advocating on behalf of residents and our attempts to both find them housing, but also in our attempts to really delay the actual sale of the building. And we formed, beginning last July, a coalition that we call the Ulster County Coalition for Housing Justice. And my colleagues in this endeavor are Rashida Tyler of the Bill Kingston Tenants Union, Margie Leopold of Ulster Immigrant Defense Network, Holly Lentz, who works for the O Positive Festival, Onisha Roy Chaduri, who's an independent journalist and community member, and Mika Mar-Hale, who, like Rashida, was born and raised in Kingston, and also is related to her mother lived within Chiz until very recently, and is a formerly homeless person, so is deeply impacted. We do encourage anyone who's in the area to check out our website and our list of demands for the Ulster County government and the city of Kingston, which include good cause eviction. And it was so encouraging to hear Rebecca talk about what's been happening in Albany. We do hope to replicate those results in Kingston as well. So there are really exciting things that are happening. So yeah, but these are my lovely, amazing comrades who I'm so honored to work with. And also, this work, like this is, as I indicated in my sort of prologue, this is like an academic paper, but also it's a report on activism that's happening literally right now. We're having a meeting with residents today. And so there'll be a point where I ask Johanna to stop recording because I don't want the strategy that we're developing to become public knowledge. So I am trained as a historian, and I want to talk a little bit about sort of two competing histories of Chiz's Heart Street that I think will help to explain what I mean by sentimental violence. So what I'm going to talk about on this slide is essentially the history of Chiz's Heart Street that you would learn if you followed basically mainstream newspaper coverage or local news reports over the last 17 years, which featured Chiz, including the New York Times. That's where that high-res photo came from, and the Daily Freeman and Spectrum News. So what you would learn about Chiz's Heart Street if you followed that coverage is that this is that in 2004, a former Air Force veteran, Mary Chisholm, no relation. Every time I see her name, I'm like, wait, but obviously not. Found Chiz's Heart Street in a massive colonial on West Chestnut Street in Kingston. And she begins to offer seemingly free housing and food based up, and she's able to do so through donations to folks who are described as schizophrenic or having severe mental illness. The word schizophrenia is the most common word in the popular descriptions of what happened to Chiz's Heart Street. And that popular coverage of the boarding house features Chiz as the sole protagonist, as the kind of only caregiver and who operating out of altruism. The shelter is quite literally anthropomorphized as an extension of herself and her massive heart. Longtime Kingston residents also call it Chiz's Place. So as you'll see in this quote, this is a home for people who have typically not had a home, right? So there's, in the initial Chiz's Heart building, there's 30 rooms and about 40 beds or so. But this is not enough room for all the people who need services because, as I'll talk about a bit more later, a whole host of folk that Chiz ends up housing are people who, it's not just that they don't have a home, no other home, they themselves actually have navigated through a number of different systems and avoided institutionalization, whether it's within a psychiatric hospital or an inpatient senior assisted living facility. They've managed to find their way around those efforts to institutionalize them and arrive at CHIS, but the press coverage only frames CHIS as an actor. The residents are just objects of care. So it starts off as being a 30-room boarding house with about 40 beds. But then in 2014, she's able to somehow, again, I'm sort of characterizing the news coverage, she is able to somehow move to Washington Avenue, which is the place where the boarding room is now. And it's a collection of 3 colonial houses, all together at 256 Washington Avenue. And it's, there's a real expansion of the number of people who are able to live there. Up to 60 beds are now available. And there's a massive commercial kitchen. So CHIS is able, as you'll see in this photo, to offer up not just meals for residents, but meals for people who will just stop by. There's a massive pantry. And all throughout Kingston, people donate clothes and food to CHIS. There's a sense of collective care from middle-class Kingston residents that they're part of the story of care of these folks. Okay, so, and all that's lovely. I don't want to suggest there's anything wrong with it. I was gonna show you a little clip here to maybe oversell the point that CHIS is the sole protagonist in all narratives around CHIS, but maybe you get the point. But it's just also, it's not the full story of the place. And something else emerges when we look at what I want to think about as like a property history of where CHIS is now, right? So despite the narratives, Mary Chisholm has never owned any part of CHIS Hart Street. It's owned by what's been called the Stockade Group Limited Liability Corporation. And we did a ton of, we were so lucky to be able to do work. Everything that I'm expressing to you is like based upon our multiple visits to CHIS, and then also our kind of very guerrilla investigative reporting, like tracking down, well, who actually owns that and what do they do? Which is also possible in a small town, which is lovely, because people talk and love to gossip. So in 2003, this Stockade Group purchased 256 Washington Avenue, which is, when you'll see it on the zoning map, includes all 3 of these buildings together. And they did so for about $500,000. And it's funny, when we confront the owners today, which we've been able to do again through all kinds of spy versus spy tracking down, they claim that they paid $650,000 for it, but the property records indicate they didn't pay that much anyway. So they paid about $500,000 for it, and none of them actually live in Kingston. They're part of this really fascinating phenomenon that I've written about elsewhere, which is that within the working class communities of Kingston, the vast majority of property owners are either New York City based or based in more well-off communities like Woodstock or in Saugerties. And there's a real correlation between non-local ownership of rental properties and neglect, right? And so that's what these folks have been sort of engaged in, or they allow nonprofits to run the properties as charitable endeavors, which it gets tons of donations and looks very good, but then they as owners have no responsibility, or at least they purport to have no responsibility to the residents. And one of the reasons why that's really unfortunate is that everyone who lives at this property, whether it's when it's run by CHIS or when it's run by an early nonprofit, is receiving support from either the county or a federal welfare program. So it's private collection of public monies, but no responsibility on the part of the owners to actually be good stewards of that money or to actually care for the people who they profit off of. So they buy the property in 2003, and it's first leased to a nonprofit called Washington Manor, which is a boarding house, but is not for people who have disabilities. It's just for folks who don't have a lot of money. And so there's the neglect of the owners, and then there's the complicity of the county government, who is always referring folks who can't pay rent to boarding houses. And this is a major problem in Kingston. It's not, I mean, it's like the SRO struggles of New York City in the 1970s and 80s just like didn't happen upstate. They're just still allowed to operate with impunity. We've heard stories of another boarding house proprietor who, again, this is from people who were impacted, but we can't prove it, but who apparently like asked people to turn over their TAMP benefits or to pay parts of their welfare grants to him just so that they can get a room. So there's all kinds of corruption that's happening because the county doesn't have adequate affordable housing, and so it relies upon these boarding houses to put people up. So, and there's also complicity within like the zoning politics. So this is why you're seeing this zoning map. So if you look on where it says Washington Avenue and not Maine, but yeah, Washington Avenue in Maine, sorry, 36 there, that's Chis's Hart Street, that kind of weirdly huge lot. And it has, if you look at R2 on the left and you go a little bit further south, you'll see Main Street and then you'll see Washington Avenue. And that number 36, that really huge lot there, is Chis's Hart Street. And you're like, why is that huge lot within a residential zone? It's because every year they get a special variance from the planning board that allows them to still function as a rooming house, even though it's supposed to be a limit of 2-family residences in that area. So there's complicity from the planning board, there's complicity from the welfare department, and also from the building department, because when we first visited Chiz in April, we were like, this place has like not been condemned. I mean, there were 2 broken bathrooms. It did not smell like an amazing place to live. And so there's the county government sort of allows for things to be not so great because they don't have the capacity to actually serve the people's housing needs. So in 2013, Washington Manor is dissolved and replaced by Chis's Hart Street. And then, as I mentioned earlier, referrals come from all over probation, parole, psychiatric hospitals to try to get folks housed with Chiz. And as I mentioned earlier, all the residents receive some form of aid, and now under Chiz, they go from receiving aid from the county to even more so receiving aid from federal, either Social Security or SSI programs. So which the owners are able to pocket, but there's all kinds of weirdnesses there because there are no lease agreements. Like it's not even 30-day month to month. There's literally no lease agreements whatsoever. In a certain kind of way, the people are still legally homeless. They don't have any tenancy except for at-will tenancy rights, right? So, so why does sentimental violence create these barriers to advocacy? I want to just talk a little bit about what I mean by sentimental violence, which I'm borrowing, from literary studies, from post-colonial studies, from critical disability studies, right? And the kind of simplest way of sort of thinking about it is to interrogate the way expressions of care or sympathy or even empathy for the downtrodden other, the marginalized other, have authorized power, broadly defined, for either states or even more importantly, other marginalized groups. So most thing that's been most discussed the most is of course early feminists in the Victorian era, right? Who are able to only intervene in public life and influence state action by appealing to their care for others, whether it's the poor or their own experience of vulnerability, whether it's and like the vulnerability of say attack from a drinking husband. This is the origin of the temperance movement, right? And I don't think we should offer a kind of cynical utilitarian reading of sentimentalism as strategy, though that surely does exist. But I think we should think about it as one of the many sort of ideological hyphen experiential modes through which people manage their desire to help, the desire for authority, the desire to change things, to defend themselves and other people. And that we should think about folks' access to sentimentalism as also conditioned by their relationship to power. But we can't be even simplistic about that, but because, for example, the Trump campaign, despite being about a so-called hard man, is uber sentimental. It's all about we care for our veterans, right? What does he do? He like hugs the flag. I mean, the sentimentalism is part of authoritarianism. So I don't think it's that simplistic. But what really matters, I think, is the way in which in Kingston, New York, sentimentalism made it really, really hard for us as advocates to figure out who we should bring our concerns to, who was actually in charge of stuff. And it led to all kinds of ineffectual activisms, like, for example, this fundraiser, which this GoFundMe that someone created because they believed that the problem was that Chiz was behind on her mortgage payments because they believed that Chiz owned the place, because that's the public narrative completely, where like care and ownership just sort of get blurred in terms of people's associations. And even the residents, when we would go visit residents and they would say, why is Chiz kicking me out? And we had to explain to them many times that she didn't actually own the building, that even though she was the center of people's worlds, they had become so dependent upon her emotionally. Like one of the women just said that Chiz would love dunk people, which I thought was the most beautiful and frightening way of describing how this relationship works, right? Or worked. That she would love dunk you and sort of get people into the building, and then, but once it came to time for it to be sold, there was no accountability because she wasn't actually an owner. So there's this, when the news breaks of the building being sold, there's a flurry of activity online. People who had been sort of upset about gentrification in Kingston are suddenly like really galvanized to act because they know there's super vulnerable folks who live there. But as I mentioned, there's a real struggle in figuring out how to organize properly and who to target. It took us forever to figure out who the owners of the Sackhead Group LLC were, because of course they're protected. And there's also, I mean, there was also a kind of dependence that residents had gotten used to. And so that was sort of fueled by the donations or what have you. And so it's been difficult to sort of help them imagine themselves as like agents in the process of stopping the sale or engaging in squatting activism. So yeah, there were, the people there have what they would call like love agreements, not lease agreements. And so that's helped us in some ways, we'll talk about it in a moment, but also left us with like, wait a minute, can you prove that you've paid rent? No one got receipts for their rent payments. Can you prove that you've even lived here and that you're not, you haven't moved here so-called illegally, but then there's no contracts which govern anyone's presence. It's the strangest situation. And that meant that the Stockade Group could do all kinds of really terrible misinformation campaigns. They began to post notices telling people that the building was sold when it was only under contract, that people had to leave, which they didn't because they had at-will tenancy, and many had been there for long enough that they would have at least needed 90 days before there could be any eviction. And there was no actual legal evictions filed, but people began to leave because they didn't actually know their own rights. And then there's all the ways in which it's what ends up happening is that sentimentalism is so suffused the place that it becomes everyone's rhetorical device. So even the owners are like, well, we're getting older, we're frail now, we can't possibly take care of the residents, which they never actually did. But because the language of care is sort of what everyone uses when describing Chiz, they sort of just insert themselves into that, which is really fascinating. Similarly, in her public statements, Mary Chisholm has always said, I love the residents. It's so much, it's so unfortunate. And which is, the question is like, if that's true or not is sort of irrelevant, but it makes it hard to figure out who the actual target is. And so it's not a clear kind of class warfare. There's all kinds of emotional manipulation that you have to navigate as an organizer. And what was the last thing? Yeah, I think that was the sort of things I want to say about what we learned about why revanchism is not helpful in this particular context. And what we're doing right now, I'd love if Joanna could stop the recording.
Kwame, this is very interesting to, well, I'll not interject myself any further. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Look forward to learning more about your work. Joanna has informed me that Jan Lin is present, and we'll make space for about 10 minutes for Jan Lin's presentation. So Jan, the room, virtual as it is yours.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me all right? And I'm so sorry that I'm late. I'd like to thank all the panelists and audience for being here, and Joanna Lundino for organizing along with her co-organizers. And yes, so to start, I was at the New School of Social Research in 1988, when around the time Neil Smith wrote that first article. I am so impressed by the fact that over 30 years later that we still have class struggle going on in our cities, urban denizens as chief motors of class struggle, as opposed to workers in factories, that we can think of cities as a growth machine, as factories in a sense, and that the kind of class struggle that he spoke of, this kind of wild frontier, that if we view that as a form of settler colonialism, not on the rural frontier, but instead on the urban frontier, that the critique of that type of settler colonialism is still at hand here. In the case that I look at in Los Angeles, that the protesters of gentrification called gentrification the new colonialism. And that what is also so interesting is that if you look at Neil Smith's look at who is being displaced, who is being marginalized. It's not just these activists standing up for the homeless, but it's also the Latinx Puerto Rican immigrants of New York City. Whereas now in 21st century Los Angeles, it's a new cast of characters on the West Coast, Mexican origin and Central American origin immigrants now being displaced. Why this takes place 30 years later in Los Angeles? One of my explanations would be possibly that urban sprawl in Los Angeles had taken place for so many decades, and that the interest in a central city location came somewhat later. That sprawl kind of hit the wall finally in Los Angeles, and that we have a later incidence of gentrification and the mass displacement problems. I'm going to try to quickly now also move to a screen share. And now I'm just looking for the screen share button. Let me see now, the screen share button. Let me see. Okay, sorry, just bearing with me. Screen share button, is there a screen share button?
Should be at the bottom.
Right, yeah, for some reason my view got truncated. So I'm going to try to enlarge my view. For some reason, my view got truncated as soon as I got on. Full screen. Okay, here we go. And there is the screen share. And here is my screen share. And is the screen share looking okay? It may not be full screen, but I think it'll do. Just a plug here for an earlier book, From Urban Village to East Village by Janet Abalugode, my mentor and teacher. She invited Neil Smith to a session of our Urban Pro Seminar back in 1988, 1989. He presented an early version of chapter 1. Also, my colleague, Christopher Neely, who is at SUNY Buffalo, and he wrote his book also on the Lower East Side. These are older books, just want people to know that they're around, that they expand upon the Lower East Side chapter, which is chapter 1 of Neil Smith's book. Here is my own book, Taking Back the Boulevard, Art Activism and Gentrification in Los Angeles, with a focus on Northeast Los Angeles. Here's a larger map of Glendale, Pasadena, there's Northeast Los Angeles in there. That's a map of Los Angeles there, and Northeast LA is in this little pocket here. Early article on from the LA Times on Northeast LA as a hipsterville, as a neo-bohemia. Here's a map of Northeast LA, and you can see Eagle Rock and Glass Hill Park, some of these communities. Occidental College is located right there. And there is a community down at the bottom, Boyle Heights, which is the topic of Alfredo Juante's presentation. The theoretical kind of apparatus that I work with, I'm going to keep it short, a stage model of gentrification. That gentrification does occur in stages, that there is an earlier stage when pioneers come in and that they are later displaced by a larger population of gentrifiers. I push things further back to an urban history cycle, that there's an initial stage of investment in these inner ring streetcar suburbs of Los Angeles, like Northeast Los Angeles, that then there's a disinvestment period, such as tie into the rent gap theory of Neil Smith, and also Neil Smith's mentor, David Harvey, goes into the rent gap theory. That rent gap is created, and that move to the suburbs and all that capital and move of jobs and people, it leaves opportunities for immigrants to come in. And I really believe that immigrants are involved with a third reinvestment, but in a revitalization stage, that they are in effect also pioneers, that they keep these districts relatively capitally stable because they are moving into the opportunity, and that they are later then displaced by more affluent gentrifiers. That the pioneers are then later displaced, and that you can actually see the racial ethnic transition. The gray is whites declining, and the green is Latinx, Hispanics increasing, but that from 1960 to 2000, but from 2000 to 2010, we begin to see a gradual increase in whites. These slides I'm not going to be able to have as much time with, but neoliberal urbanism going on, the federal rollback of federal spending in cities, and a move to more private public partnership, transit stations as a main locus of neoliberal growth, and that the transit stations become epicenters for gentrification. At least I see it in Los Angeles, that the Great Recession of 2007 to 2010 created a temporary kind of stalling of the gentrification process, but it came roaring back with foreclosures and speculator flippers coming into Northeast LA, and the city beginning to try to spark creative economy, small lot development, transit-oriented development with transit villages located at transit stations. And then in response to the gentrification dynamics that developed, and the displacement from single family homes, but then the displacement of working class and immigrants, residents from multifamily apartment buildings, mass displacements, that's what really began to spark the movement protesting gentrification in Northeast LA, and more broadly in Los Angeles can be seen here's that transit village, and a group of residents called Friends of Highland Park organized against this transit village, and they were ultimately able to block it, citing lack of environmental impact review. So the city had to go back to the drawing board. Then a very large multi-unit apartment building called the Marmion Royal, right next to that transit station, sparked a rent strike by the organizers of the Northeast Los Angeles Alliance. They were ultimately not able to stop the eviction of all of these residents, but they learned so much in the process, and they put forth really the question of affordable housing. They were able to put it into public debate. And I think that's the important thing about these kinds of movements. Again, this poster, this photo, gentrification is the new colonialism. One of their catchphrases, that housing is a human right. They carry around this projector at night during their nighttime rally, that there is an arts. The arts are part of the toolkit of these protesters. They put up these masks, and that these masks signify the animals that were displaced in the original act of settler colonialists in Los Angeles. They're saying that they see kinship with the displacement of the animals, that they protested at the site of cafes, and they organized mock evictions. This is very similar to what happened in Boyle Heights, the protesting of coffee shops as precursors of gentrification, the protesting of even art galleries as kind of Trojan horses of gentrification, beautiful looking horses, but that they hid something that was more virulent inside, that they were not led by the police on horseback, such as we saw in Tompkins Square, but that it's a more subtle process sometimes now in this era of hipsters versus the cries against the die yuppie scum of the late 1980s. The arts that they, while marching, here is a puppet that they call El Capitalista, a puppet of a greedy landlord, that they held candlelight vigils, and this particular vigil around Christmas to kind of commemorate the biblical search of Joseph and Mary for housing with their new baby on Christmas Eve, and that in fact that they were in the search for new housing. The candlelight vigils sometimes held also at the homes of landowners, that even when they were being evicted and had a sense that the battle was being lost, that they even commemorated that artistically, the dancing cantos of an evicted pueblo. But they also protested at the site of the city councilman's office. They brought their eviction agreements, and the Northeast LA Alliance, they organized tenants workshops also. So their full toolkit included the street protests, lobbying with the city councilor, sometimes using land use lawyers to argue for environmental impact review for projects that it was believed would displace people, organizing tenants workshops, using the arts sometimes as part of their own toolkit of organizing. And even if it looked like they were going to lose, even if it looked like they were going to be evicted, that they would still use the art to kind of express the sense of loss, the sense of outrage, the sense of dispossession. And sometimes as a way of kind of processing loss in a way reflectively through the vigils, because even communally coming together, that if they could create a sense of community out of resistance, then this is why I was saying that art is part of that toolkit. And in Boyle Heights, of course, we had protests against art galleries. That's the Defend Boyle Heights group, and here's a protest against the Weird Waves Cafe, owned by 2 Caucasian owners and 1 middle class, I think he was a South American owner. And of course, this will be the topic of Alfredo Huante's papers. I don't want to steal too much of his thunder, just to point out that in fact, Boyle Heights is the heart of Latinx East LA, and that Northeast LA is an extension of that group. And finally, David Harvey, again, the teacher, the mentor of Neil Smith, who along with Henri Lefebvre spoke about the necessity for looking at class struggle in the cities now, not just in the factories, and saying that in this right to the city, we have to think of new rights, that they can be defined like the right to the city, which is not merely a right of access to what property speculators and state planners define, but have an active right to make the city different, to shape it more in accord with our heart's desire, and to remake ourselves thereby in a different message, and to try to affect public policy and to put the issue in the public debate, even when it seems that they've lost, they've been displaced, they've been evicted. And what did they do after that? If they felt that they had some 1 or 2 losses in Northeast LA, some the Northeast of Los Angeles Alliance, the organizers, they moved on to nearby communities.
Hey, Jan, I'm sorry to cut this a bit short. We want to save some time for questions and answers. We have about 10 minutes left. I appreciate your forbearance. And right now, let me open up the floor for some questions, time permitting. Kafui Ato, pardon me if I'm mispronouncing your name. You posted a question to the chat. Feel free to ask your question for Kwame.
Hi, this is a question for Kwame. Thanks for a great talk. I'm based in Hudson, I'm based in Poughkeepsie, and I know a lot of people in the Kingston area. And one of the things that's been interesting to me about Kingston's experience, especially post-COVID, but it started long before that, is the kind of transformation of the really rapid transformation of the city over the course of a very short period of time, and in a way that's different from other cities in the Hudson Valley, like Hudson or like Beacon. And one of the differences, I think, is, at least one of the things that's jumped out at me, is the size and scope of the Novo Foundation in Kingston and its kind of targeted approach at philanthropy there. So my question was kind of how you see those connected, and how, you know, where, as I was saying, Smith doesn't talk too much about either small cities or philanthropy, but they do seem, at least in Kingston, to matter for philanthropy and what's going on. So thanks.
No worries. I mean, I actually would want to put some pressure upon the idea that Novo has exacerbated the housing crisis or contributed to it in any way that's measurable. I think that Beacon was already had lots of really well-off areas kind of before Kingston did, because it's closer to the city. And I think Hudson being a place, which I can say this is, you know, kind of a mini Chelsea, I mean, has its own gentrification drivers. And I think it's a global, I mean, the property grab is a global phenomenon. And I much like crime rates, I get a little bit skeptical when it's like, well, this is the one local factor which explains, you know, this national phenomenon, which isn't to say that there aren't things about Novo's outsized presence vis-a-vis like any other entity, or even sometimes larger than the state, that are things to be concerned about. They're not democratic, not particularly transparent. That the tablet essay that I think people should read, I think is quite right about the fact that, like, it's just not always clear how they make decisions for who to fund. But I don't believe that I mean, the things which Samadhi, for example, which Novo does fund, is probably one of the strongest anti-gentrification forces in the neighborhoods that it operates in, because there's a whole bunch of people in active addiction using and walking around the building all the time in public. In fact, to the point people are kind of annoyed about it, right? So like the things that, and the other group which is most powerfully funded by Novo, Rise Up Kingston, is very anti-police and is sort of not always the most popular. So the drivers of gentrification to Kingston are, it has a lovely marina in the Rondout area. It's the Rhinecliff train is just across the river. It's the mountains are just behind it. You know, these are the things which drive gentrification, and also the kind of the release of pressure in the cities. You know, people saying like, I don't want to be cooped up in COVID, and I think people saying, I don't want to be around urban unrest. I think the George Floyd protests have had a huge role in the land grab upstate in New York, and it hasn't been discussed as much. But there are things about Novo that are problematic, but I sort of worry about the left becoming like QAnoners and like replacing the Buffetts with the Rothschilds. And I think we should like be more locally focused.
Okay, thank you. I noticed that Aaron Shkuda has your hand up. So Aaron, please go ahead and offer your question or comment.
Sure, thanks everyone. I know we're a bit placeless at the moment, but I did want to ask, I guess, a Central New York related question. And it's something that I guess came from my rereading of Smith. And then again, I'm also one of the urban historians in the group. And one of the struggles I have in sort of interdisciplinary gentrification studies is that, you know, historians are always trying to say, well, you know, every time and every place, things function differently, where perhaps more social scientists tend to sort of you know, do a little bit more theorizing and connecting across case studies. That's a terrible way to say it. But I guess more for Rebecca, perhaps, like, does gentrification in your case study function differently in Buffalo and New York City, right? Kwame, you know, is what's going on in Kingston similar or different to your historical research in Washington, D.C.? Or I may also say, you know, to Jen, like, thinking about, you know, your studies of Los Angeles in conversation with the Lower East Side of the 1980s, something you both experienced as a faculty member, but also sort of read about in Smith, like, is it more useful to kind of think about these as individual case studies or parts of a sort of general global phenomenon?
I mean, I can jump in first. You know, for me, I think the examples look a little different in each community, but, you know, the tie that binds, right, is that we have these disinvested Black and Brown communities, and anytime investment comes to Black and Brown communities, it inherently brings gentrification and colonization, right? Like, and so I think, you know, what looks different in Central New York to Western New York to New York City to the Hudson Valley is maybe the onus, right, for what drives that, or how it rolls out. But that's the factor that connects all of them. And so we don't have policy protections in place that prevent against these investments, right, that don't ensure the displacement of these communities. And so, you know, for me, my laser focus is enacting these policies that say we can have, right, investment, right, money coming into communities without this inherent backside of it. And we just haven't seen it anywhere. And we have to have these protections, or no matter what happens, we end up in gentrification.
Yeah, so I'd like to respond to that one also. Yeah, so you're right. So sociologists are so interested in the comparisons in that theory of the stage model. It started in the US, but then Loretta Lees over in the UK and some of her co-writers, Australians sometimes, Canadians, that they find similar, I mean, you look around the world and there is planetary gentrification, says Lees and her co-authors, right? But when we move to policy, like our panelists, Ms. Gerrard was describing, the policy side of how to address that is, we might want to think of that in more local terms, because how do you resolve something that happens at the local neighborhood level that you've got to also deal with those local dynamics? You know, you can have a national urban policy around, you know, how to do urban work, but that sometimes resolving the issues might be more locally based, and understanding how to achieve that with local city officials and local grassroots groups.
I think it's a marriage of the two. Sorry, Kwame, and I will let you, but I do think it's important to have it be a marriage of the two, because the reality is if we rely solely on local policy, we are going to inherently have, right, local communities that are controlled by policymakers who are conservative and Republican in their policy making, drive that, and we're going to have huge gaps, right? And we're going to have huge swaths of the state and the country that are not protected. And so it has to be a marriage of the two, where yes, localities can say this works for me, but we have an overarching force and driver that says these are protections and policy points across the area, because we recognize that this is not existed and needed.
Yeah, I'll close just by saying that because I care about feelings a lot, and I care about culture a lot. I think that there is something really different about the feeling of a middle-class white person like moving to Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights, and experiencing a sense of being foreign, versus maybe even that same person now moving to Kingston. And there's this kind of narrative that I've heard a lot, which is like people have a sense of like, oh, I'm coming home, you know, and coming back to like the country, or even if they're not from there, though many people actually are people who grew up in this area and who've just come back. But so I think that the question is like, what does that mean in terms of the kinds of policy that folks will support? You know, will the person who moved into a foreign territory, you know, in the 80s or 90s be more likely to vote for Rudy Giuliani so they can feel safer? I mean, I think it's probably true that the gentrifiers also didn't vote for Giuliani, that it's people who are actually ensconced within like the Upper West Side. But anyway, but like, or versus when they feel like they're coming home, are they more progressive or not? Those are interesting questions. And then I was also struck by some of the enormous similarities, like the fact that you have a ton of absentee landlords, and that, you know, Kingston has this sense of like being very insular. But when you look at the property database and you see how many New York City addresses own property up here, it's like, well, what is a small town? Like the property relationships really complicate the boundaries of what we would imagine as a small town. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, and I know we're over time, but
Okay, thank you.
just okay, I'll stop.
We have a couple more questions. And I'm glad to see a lot of attention paid to the Central Hudson Valley. I'm working on a urban renewal project that involves Kingston and Newburgh, among other places. So I'm glad to see a shift away from New York City and the major cities to smaller places. I think scale is important. We have a comment from Derek Hyra. Derek, please go ahead and offer your comment.
Oh, can you all hear me? Someone give me the thumbs up. All right. I've really enjoyed the first panel. We're already getting hot and heated and getting into federal, local policies. I didn't really have a comment. All I wanted to, or I didn't have a question. The comment, and it's really just for Rebecca. It's also related to Jan. Some of the things that you've said is you know, Rebecca, you sort of started off with public housing as being one of the policies that segregated communities, and you're absolutely right with that. But you didn't offer public housing as maybe a possible solution to keeping people in place. And I just put into the chat that I sort of feel that public housing, much of it is located in inner city areas in the US that are experiencing gentrification right now or have experienced it. And I think that public housing and investing in that in places that are gentrifying is a real way to keep people in place. I appreciated your no cause eviction policy ideas and TOPA and all the things you said were great. But I would just add that I really think that yes, public housing has facilitated the segregation of the United States, but it also can be utilized as an anti-displacement tool. And I know that, you know, you take this context from the US, maybe bring it to the UK and in London, a lot of that public housing stock is going down in areas that are gentrifying. So I would hope that we would think creatively how to advocate for public housing locally and nationally to help keep people in place when their communities are transitioning economically. So that's the only point. Thank you.
Yeah, and I 100% agree with you. I mean, I was running over time, but I couldn't agree with you more. It is vitally important that we invest in public housing to do it correctly. It is something that could be a solution and hasn't been because it's been done wrong, but I couldn't agree with you more.
I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but feel free to just jump in verbally if I'm missing someone. Okay. We're a few minutes past time. The next session is not till 1 o'clock. So if there are any final questions or comments, we can certainly entertain them and feel free to pose them. I posted 3 points that I think, you know, in the role of discussant, I tried to sort of think about how all three presenters, the work of all three presenters fit together. I've offered those in the chat. I'm not going to verbalize them, but I hope that we can continue the conversation, and I would like to emphasize the role of smaller places and scales of agency as I think really important and exciting directions for future research, not just research, but advocacy. So with that said, I will step back again. Any final questions, thoughts, remarks? I see a question in the Q&A from Paul Watt. Paul, did you want to verbalize your comment? Okay, well, Paul says, great point, Derek. Yes, London housing is reducing due to demolition, but still 390,000 units there. Anything you want to add, Paul? Paul, feel free to type in the chat or the Q&A if you're unable to enable your microphone. Okay, no worries. Well, if there's no other comments or remarks, I'd like to close this out and again express my deepest appreciation and gratitude for these 3 excellent papers. Kwame, I would love to know more about your work in Kingston. I think we may have the start of a conversation that could be useful to us both. In any event, thank you all for your attention. Thank you to the presenters, and let's give everyone a big hand. It doesn't translate well over Zoom, but thank you, everybody. And I will hopefully see you all at the next session at 1 p.m. Take care, everybody, and enjoy your short break.